The rain drummed against the windows of the colonial-style house on Maple Street, creating a rhythmic backdrop to what would become the most shocking afternoon of Sarah Mitchell's life. She stood in her spacious kitchen, the granite countertops, gleaming under the warm pendant lights, stirring a pot of homemade tomato soup. The aroma of fresh basil filled the air as she prepared what she thought would be a cozy dinner for two. The kitchen was Sarah's pride and joy, a perfect blend of functionality and warmth that she'd designed herself when she bought the house 9 years ago. Cream-colored cabinets with brushed nickel hardware lined the walls, complemented by a subway tile backsplash that caught the light from the recessed fixtures above. The large island in the center provided both workspace and seating, with 3 bar stools upholstered in soft gray fabric that she'd reupholstered herself last spring. Fresh herbs grew in small pots on the windowsill above the farmhouse sink. Basil, oregano, thyme, and rosemary that she used daily in her cooking. The sight of them always made her smile, reminding her of her grandmother's garden in small-town Nebraska, where she'd learned to cook as a child. Those were simpler times, when the biggest worry was whether the tomatoes would ripen before the first frost. At 34, Sarah had built a comfortable life in suburban Denver, Colorado. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, highlighting the delicate freckles across her nose that she'd inherited from her Irish grandmother. She wore her favorite navy blue cardigan over dark jeans, clothes that were both practical and feminine, reflecting her personality perfectly. The house around her reflected her careful attention to detail and her love of creating a warm home environment. Family photos adorned the marble mantel above the gas fireplace. Pictures of her parents' farm in Nebraska, her college graduation, from University of Colorado Boulder, her wedding day 8 years ago, when she and Marcus had looked so happy and full of hope. Fresh flowers sat in crystal vases throughout the main floor, mostly tulips and daffodils from her own garden that she'd planted in neat rows along the front walkway. Everything had its place, carefully chosen and lovingly maintained. This wasn't just a house. It was her sanctuary, her pride and joy, the tangible proof of her independence and success. The front door slammed with unusual force, making the decorative plates on the kitchen wall rattle. Sarah's husband Marcus strode in, his expensive Italian, leather shoes clicking against the hardwood floors. At 38, Marcus cut an imposing figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair that he kept meticulously styled. His charcoal gray suit was impeccable as always, but something in his demeanor felt different today. "You're home early," Sarah said, turning from the stove with a warm smile that had greeted him for 8 years of marriage. "I was just making your favorite soup, the tomato basil with fresh herbs from the garden. How was your day at the firm? Did the Morrison case settlement go through?" She was genuinely curious about his work, had always been supportive of his career ambitions. When he'd been stressed about making partner track, she'd encouraged him. When he'd worked late nights preparing for major cases, she'd brought him dinner and rubbed his shoulders. She thought they were a team, partners in building a life together. Marcus loosened his burgundy silk tie without meeting her eyes, his movements sharp and agitated. The tie had been a Christmas gift from Sarah 2 years ago, chosen because it brought out the blue in his eyes. Now he yanked at it like it was choking him. "We need to talk, Sarah." The wooden spoon in her hand suddenly felt heavy as lead. She set it down carefully on the ceramic spoon rest, a wedding gift from her sister Emma that featured hand-painted wildflowers. Her heart began to beat faster, that instinctive recognition that something was very, very wrong. In 8 years of marriage, Marcus had never come home and announced they needed to talk with such cold formality. "What about? You sound so serious, honey. Did something happen at work?" He reached into his briefcase, the same leather Hermes, case she'd saved for 3 months to buy him for their 5th anniversary, back when she thought expensive gifts showed love, and pulled out a manila envelope. The paper crinkled ominously as he placed it on the kitchen island between them, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden, oppressive silence that had descended over their usually warm home. "I want a divorce, Sarah." The words hit her like a physical blow, like someone had punched her in the stomach and knocked all the air from her lungs. She gripped the edge of the granite countertop, her knuckles turning white as she tried to steady herself. The kitchen, her beautiful kitchen that had been the heart of their home, suddenly felt like it was spinning around her. What? Marcus, what are you talking about? We were just discussing vacation plans last week. You said you wanted to go to Napa Valley in the spring, remember? You were excited about that wine tour. His steel blue eyes remained cold, detached, like he was looking at a stranger instead of the woman he'd promised to love and cherish until death do them part. I've been thinking about this for months. We've grown apart. We want different things. It's better if we end this now, while we can still be civilized about it. Sarah's mind raced, trying to process his words while her world crumbled around her. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in on her as she struggled to understand what was happening. Months? You've been planning this for months and didn't say anything? Marcus, we can work through whatever's bothering you. We can go to counseling. We can take that trip we talked about. I've already filed the papers, he interrupted, tapping the envelope with his manicured finger. The sound was sharp, final, like a judge's gavel sealing her fate. I've been consulting with Patterson, Williams & Associates, top divorce attorneys in Denver. They've advised me on how to make this as straightforward as possible. Her hands trembled as she stared at the envelope like it contained a death sentence. Patterson, Williams & Associates. She knew that name from the society pages, from whispered conversations at charity events. They handled the ugliest, most contentious divorces in the city. Rich, powerful men used them when they wanted to, destroy their wives in court, when they wanted to walk away with everything while leaving their former partners with nothing. Straightforward? Her voice cracked, the sound foreign to her own ears. Marcus, we've been married for 8 years. We built a life together. We have shared friends, shared memories, shared dreams. How is any of this straightforward? He began, pacing the kitchen, his movements sharp and agitated, like a caged animal looking for escape. His expensive shoes clicked against the hardwood with increasing urgency. Look, Sarah, I'm not trying to be cruel here, but let's be realistic about our situation. I make 4 times what you make at that little nonprofit of yours. I've been the primary breadwinner, the one making the real financial decisions for this household. My name is on the mortgage, the car loans, all the investment accounts. Each word felt like a slap across her face, each assumption a dagger to her heart. Sarah sank onto one of the bar stools, her legs suddenly unsteady, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. The stool she'd sat on thousands of mornings, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper while Marcus got ready for work. Now it felt like a foreign object in a foreign place. Your name is on the mortgage? Of course it is. I'm the one with the credit score and the income to qualify for a loan this size. He gestured around the kitchen dismissively like he was discussing a piece of furniture instead of their home. This house is worth what? $400,000? Maybe $450 in this market? We'll sell it, split the proceeds 50-50. Same with the cars, the savings accounts, the retirement funds. My attorneys say it should be pretty cut and dried. Sarah's world tilted on its axis, everything she thought she knew sliding away like sand through her fingers. She watched her husband of 8 years pace through their kitchen, her kitchen, as he casually dismantled their life together with the cold efficiency of a demolition crew. The man she'd shared breakfast with that very morning, who'd kissed her cheek and said, "Have a good day, honey," in the same casual way he had for 8 years, was now looking at her like a business transaction to be concluded as quickly and efficiently as possible. "You think your name is on the mortgage," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. He stopped pacing and looked at her with visible irritation, like she was being deliberately obtuse. "I don't think it, Sarah. I know it. I signed the papers. I've been making the payments for 8 years. I've been carrying this household financially since day 1 of our marriage." The rain outside intensified, sheets of water cascading down, the windows like tears. Sarah could hear the wind picking up, rattling the shutters she'd painted periwinkle blue 3 summers ago during a weekend when Marcus had been golfing with clients. She remembered that weekend vividly now, spending 2 days in the hot July sun, carefully painting each wooden slat while he enjoyed air-conditioned clubhouses and expensive scotch. She'd been proud of those shutters, proud of the way they made their house look more welcoming, more like a home. "Marcus," she said, her voice steadier now as something crystalline and sharp began to form in her chest. "When exactly do you think we bought this house?" He waved his hand dismissively, the gesture sharp and impatient. 2 years after we got married. 2018. The market was just starting to recover from the recession, remember? Good timing on my part, actually. I locked in a great rate with First National Bank. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, like a puzzle piece clicking, into place with an almost audible snap. The fog of shock and disbelief began to clear, replaced by something else. Something sharper, more focused, more dangerous. She felt like she was seeing clearly for the first time in hours, maybe even years. "And when did we get married, Marcus?" "What kind of question is that?" He stopped pacing and stared at her like she'd lost her mind. June 15th, 2016. "Our 8th anniversary is coming up in a few months, for God's sake. Why are you—" He stopped mid-sentence, his brow furrowing as some distant alarm bell began to ring in his consciousness. "Marcus," Sarah said slowly, deliberately, standing up from the barstool with newfound purpose. "I bought this house in March of 2015, 14 months before we even got engaged, let alone married." The color drained from his face like water from a broken dam. "That's not— No, that can't be right. You're confused, Sarah. The stress of this conversation is making you remember things wrong." She walked to the built-in desk in the corner of the kitchen with measured, deliberate steps, her movements calm and purposeful now. The desk was another feature she'd loved about the house when she'd first seen it. A perfect space for paying bills, organizing household paperwork, planning, meals. From the mahogany filing cabinet, she pulled out a folder labeled House Documents in her careful handwriting. "I bought this house with my inheritance from my grandmother Rose," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word as she placed the folder on the island like evidence in a courtroom. $150,000 cash down. Payment. The mortgage is in my name only, Marcus. It always has been. Every single payment for the past 9 years has come from my personal checking account." Marcus stared at the folder like it might explode in his face. His confident demeanor was cracking like ice on a warm spring day. Uncertainty, and something that looked dangerously close to panic flickering across his usually composed features. "You're confused, Sarah. The stress is making you—" "Am I?" She opened the folder with surgical precision and pulled out the deed, the most important document in her life. The official paperwork was crisp and clear, the Colorado state seal embossed at the top in gold, lending it an undeniable authority. "Sarah Elizabeth Henderson," she read aloud, using her maiden name with deliberate emphasis. "Sole owner. Purchased. March 23, 2015, from Robert and Margaret Walsh for the sum of $285,000. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the storm outside and the gentle bubbling of the forgotten soup on the stove. Marcus's confident demeanor finally shattered completely, uncertainty and dawning horror flickering across his features like shadows on a wall. "But I've been making the mortgage payments," he said weakly, his voice smaller than she'd ever heard it. "I know I have. The money comes out every month." "No, Marcus. You've been contributing to household expenses as my husband. The mortgage payment, all $1,147 of it every month, comes out of my personal checking account at Colorado Community Bank. It always has." Sarah's voice was calm, almost gentle, like she was explaining something simple to a confused child. "Did you ever actually look at our financial arrangements? Did you ever examine a single bank statement? A single piece of mail from the mortgage company? Or did you just assume?" He reached for the deed with a shaking hand, but she pulled it back gently but firmly. "The cars you mentioned so confidently? The BMW is yours. You bought it 6 months before we married, and the payments come directly from your personal account. My Honda Civic is mine, purchased 2 years ago, and I paid it off last year. The only joint accounts we have are our checking and savings accounts for household expenses, which we each contribute to equally every month." Marcus slumped against the kitchen island like a man who'd just been told he had a terminal illness, all the fight and arrogance draining out of him like air from a punctured balloon. The weight of his catastrophic miscalculation was beginning to settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. "I don't understand. How is this possible? I'm the one with the high-paying job. I'm the one who assumed that being the bigger earner meant you owned everything?" Sarah finished, her voice taking on an edge of steel that he'd never heard before. "Marcus, I never needed you to take care of me financially. I never asked you to. I never even hinted that I couldn't handle my own affairs. I had my house, my car, my savings, my career before we met. I was doing just fine on my own. Thank you very much." The weight of his assumption, the sheer magnitude of his miscalculation, began to settle on his shoulders like an avalanche. 8 years of marriage, and he'd never once questioned the financial arrangements that had seemed so natural, so obvious to him. Sarah paid for groceries and utilities. He paid for dinners out and vacations. She handled what he'd assumed was their mortgage and property taxes. He covered his car payment and country club membership. It had worked seamlessly precisely because they'd never fought about money, because Sarah had never questioned his assumptions, never corrected his misunderstandings. "So what does this mean?" he asked, his voice small. Sarah looked around her kitchen, at the copper pots hanging from the rack she'd installed, at the herb garden visible through the window, at the breakfast nook where they'd shared 8 years of morning coffee. "It means, Marcus, that you just filed for divorce assuming you'd get half of a house that isn't half yours." She walked back to the stove and turned off the burner under the soup. The bubbling stopped, leaving only the sound of rain and the sudden, crushing weight of reality settling over Marcus Patterson Mitchell. "I think," Sarah said quietly, "we definitely need to talk." The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the storm having washed the Denver air clean and left everything sparkling under a brilliant blue sky. Sarah sat at her kitchen table with a steaming cup of French roast coffee, watching the sunrise paint, the Rocky Mountains in shades of pink and gold. She'd barely slept 3 hours, but she felt oddly energized, like she was seeing the world with new clarity after years of looking through someone else's lens. The house felt different in the morning, light, not empty or hollow as she'd expected, but somehow more authentically hers. Without Marcus's presence filling the space with his assumptions and expectations, she could hear the house's natural sounds, the gentle hum of the refrigerator, the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the whisper of wind through the mature oak trees she'd planted along the property line. Marcus had left the night before after their conversation devolved into stunned silence on his part and careful, methodical explanation on hers. He'd gone to stay at his brother Steve's downtown loft, taking only a hastily packed duffel bag and a completely shattered sense of certainty about his life. The expensive divorce papers sat exactly where he'd left them on the kitchen island, untouched, and somehow less threatening in the morning light. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her best friend Jessica. "Coffee this morning? You sounded weird on the phone last night. And by weird I mean like someone had hit you with a truck." She typed back, "Can you come here instead? I have news that you're not going to believe." 20 minutes later, Jessica Chen burst through the front door like a whirlwind, her black hair still damp from her morning shower, clutching 2 large coffees from Mountain Roasters, the local coffee shop they'd been frequenting for years. At 32, Jessica was a successful family law attorney, with sharp eyes behind designer glasses and an even sharper wit that had served her well in Denver's competitive legal scene. "Okay, spill everything right now," Jessica said, settling into the breakfast nook and immediately launching into full attorney mode. "When you texted that Marcus asked for a divorce, I nearly dropped my phone in the bathtub. What the actual hell happened? And don't leave out a single detail. Sarah recounted the previous evening's events in careful detail, watching Jessica's expression shift from shock to disbelief, to professional intrigue, to what could only be described as predatory glee. When she finished, Jessica was leaning forward, across the table, her elbows planted firmly, staring at Sarah with undisguised amazement. "He really thought his name was on the deed?" Jessica asked, her voice rising with incredulity. "After 8 years of marriage, he never once looked at the mortgage statements, property tax bills, homeowners' insurance documents, nothing?" "Apparently not. He just assumed everything was joint because he made more money." Sarah sipped her coffee, surprised by her own calmness. The caffeine was helping clear the last of the emotional fog from the night before. "He was so confident about it, Jess. He was ready to sell my house and split the proceeds like it was the most natural thing in the world." Jessica shook her head slowly, like she was trying to process information that defied all logic. "Honey, do you realize what this means legally? Colorado is an equitable distribution state, not community property. Anything you owned before marriage typically remains separate property, especially real estate with clear documentation and no commingling of funds." "I know. I've been reading about it since 3 a.m. Colorado divorce law, property division, separate versus marital assets. I probably know more about divorce law right now than most paralegals." And he hired Patterson, Williams, and Associates. Jessica's eyes lit up with what Sarah recognized as her friend's predatory legal smile, the one she wore when opposing counsel made a fatal error. "Oh, this is absolutely delicious." They're about to walk into the most embarrassing situation of their careers. Robert Patterson has built his reputation on being the shark who devours helpless wives. This time he's about to get eaten alive. Sarah's phone rang, Marcus's name appearing on the screen with a photo from their honeymoon in Tuscany. They looked so young and happy in that picture, she thought with a pang of sadness. She looked at Jessica, who nodded encouragingly and mouthed, "Put it on speaker." "Hello, Marcus." His voice was strained, tired, like he hadn't slept any better than she had. "Sarah, I've been thinking all night, pacing Steve's apartment like a caged animal. Maybe we should try counseling first. This divorce thing, maybe I was hasty. Maybe we can work through whatever problems we're having." Jessica raised her eyebrows and mouthed, "Too late, buddy," while making an exaggerated throat-cutting gesture. "You were hasty when you filed legal papers without discussing it with me first," Sarah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "You were hasty when you hired expensive attorneys without my knowledge. You were hasty when you decided how to divide property you apparently knew nothing about." I know. I screwed up royally. But we can work through this, can't we? We love each other. 8 years has to count for something." Sarah felt a pang of sadness for the first time since this began. "Do we, Marcus? Because last night, you looked at me like I was an obstacle to overcome, not a wife you loved. You had our entire life planned out for division like we were business partners dissolving a company. That's not. I was just being practical. Divorce is complicated, and I wanted to make sure we handled it properly. By hiring attorneys known for destroying wives in court." Sarah's voice hardened. "By assuming you owned everything and I owned nothing? That's not practical, Marcus. That's predatory." There was a long pause. "Sarah, please, can we meet? Just us, no lawyers. We can figure this out." Jessica was frantically shaking her head and mouthing, "No way." "I think," Sarah said carefully, "any further communication should go through attorneys. You made that choice when you filed papers without talking to me. But about the house, what about it?" Another pause. What happens with the house?" Sarah looked around her kitchen, at the life she'd built before Marcus, and maintained during their marriage with her own hands, her own money, her own determination. "The house is mine, Marcus. It was mine before we married, and it remains mine. Now, you'll need to find somewhere else to live permanently." But I've been paying. You've been contributing to household expenses as my husband. Now you won't be my husband. She was amazed at how calm she sounded, how clear her thinking had become. You'll need to arrange to collect your personal belongings. We can coordinate that through our attorneys. After she hung up, Jessica whistled low and slow. Damn, girl. I've never heard you sound so authoritative. So in control. It's like watching a butterfly turn into a dragon. I feel different, Sarah admitted, setting down her phone with deliberate care. Like I've been sleepwalking for 8 years and suddenly woke up to find myself in my own life. Good. Because you're going to need that energy and that clarity. Marcus might be panicking now, but once his attorneys explain the real situation to him, they're going to try every dirty trick in the book to claim some stake in this house. Sarah frowned, a flicker of worry crossing her features. Can they do that? Can they actually make a case that he has some claim? They can try, and they probably will. They might argue that his contributions to household expenses, improvements, to the property, or even just living here for 8 years gives him some equitable claim. It's a long shot in Colorado, especially with your documentation, but desperate people with expensive lawyers do desperate things. That afternoon, Sarah drove through downtown Denver to the offices of Morrison & Associates, a respected family law firm that Jessica had recommended without hesitation. The building was modern glass and steel, located in the trendy Lodo district, with spectacular views of both the downtown skyline and the Front Range Mountains. She'd dressed carefully in a navy blazer and gray slacks. Professional but not intimidating. Confident but not aggressive. Attorney David Morrison was in his 50s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and silver hair that spoke of decades of experience in family law. His office was warm and welcoming despite its professional setting, with family photos and legal awards creating a sense of both competence and compassion. Law books lined built-in shelves, and a large window offered a calming view of the mountains. Mrs. Mitchell, he said, gesturing to a comfortable leather chair across from his mahogany desk. Jessica Chen speaks very highly of you, both personally and professionally. She's given me the basic outline of your situation, but I'd like to hear the whole story from you, in your own words. Sarah recounted the story again, watching Morrison take careful notes in a leather-bound notepad. His questions were precise and professional, focusing on dates, documentation, and financial details. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, with a slight smile that suggested he was genuinely enjoying the legal puzzle she'd presented. In 25 years of family law practice, I've seen a lot of surprising situations. But this is definitely a new one, he said, tapping his pen thoughtfully against his notepad. Your husband filed for divorce assuming he owned half of a house that belongs entirely to you, and he hired one of the most aggressive firms in Denver under that assumption? That's correct. And he seemed genuinely shocked when I told him the truth, like it had never occurred to him to question his assumptions. Morrison chuckled, a warm sound that filled the office. I know Robert Patterson quite well. We've been on opposite sides of many contentious cases over the years. He's not going to be happy when he realizes what his client has gotten him into. His reputation is built on being the shark in the water, not the fish getting eaten. What should I expect? Initially, shock and damage control. They'll try to find any angle to claim Marcus has some stake in the house. After that, they'll probably push for a quick, quiet settlement to avoid the embarrassment of having their client's complete misunderstanding of his own finances become public record. Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness. And if they can't find an angle, then your husband will learn a very expensive lesson about making assumptions. Your position is strong, Mrs. Mitchell. Separate property acquired before marriage, with clear documentation, minimal commingling of funds. It's about as straightforward as these things get. As Sarah drove home through Denver's late afternoon, traffic, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, complete control over her own life. The mountains loomed ahead, purple and majestic in the fading light, and for the first time in 8 years, she felt like she could move them if she needed to. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is Robert. Patterson of Patterson, Williams and Associates. We represent your husband. We need to schedule a meeting immediately to discuss property division. There are significant assets at stake." Sarah smiled as she pulled into her driveway. Her driveway, leading to her house, on her land. She typed back, "Please direct all communication to my attorney, David Morrison of Morrison and Associates. He'll be in touch." She was done being underestimated. The real battle was about to begin. 3 weeks after Marcus's bombshell announcement, Sarah sat in the polished conference room at Morrison and Associates, feeling remarkably composed despite the magnitude of what was about to unfold. The mahogany table gleamed under soft lighting, and she could see the Denver skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. Snow had begun to dust the mountains, a reminder that winter was approaching and that her life was entering a new season. The conference room smelled of leather and coffee, with the faint scent of expensive cologne that probably belonged to opposing counsel. Sarah had chosen her outfit carefully, a charcoal gray suit that projected competence without being aggressive, paired with her grandmother's pearl earrings for luck and comfort. Across from her sat Marcus, looking haggard and uncomfortable, in a suit that seemed too big for him now. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled. He'd lost weight, she noticed, and his hands shook slightly as he shuffled through papers. Next to him, Robert Patterson looked like a man who'd swallowed something, extremely unpleasant. The senior partner of Patterson, Williams and Associates was known throughout Denver for his ruthless efficiency in high-stakes divorces, but today he appeared distinctly deflated, like a balloon slowly losing air. Patterson's junior associate, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s, sat beside him with a laptop and several thick files. Sarah recognized the setup. They'd come prepared for war, expecting to overwhelm a defenseless wife with legal firepower and intimidation tactics. David Morrison shuffled through his papers with calm professionalism, the picture of confidence and control. "Gentlemen, ladies, shall we begin?" Patterson cleared his throat and shuffled through his papers with the air of a man trying to salvage a sinking ship. "Mr. Morrison, my client is prepared to be reasonable about property division. However, we need to address the significant investments he's made in the marital home over the past 8 years. Sarah almost smiled at the word reasonable. Morrison had warned her this would be their angle, trying to establish that Marcus's contributions to household expenses somehow gave him a claim to her house. "What investments specifically?" Morrison asked mildly, his tone suggesting he was genuinely curious rather than skeptical. Patterson opened his file with a flourish, clearly hoping the documentation would lend credibility to their argument. "My client has contributed approximately $60,000 annually to household expenses, including utilities, maintenance, landscaping, and home improvements. Over 8 years, that's nearly $500,000 in investments in the property." Marcus nodded eagerly, leaning forward like a student hoping for approval. "I paid for the new HVAC system 2 years ago, the kitchen renovation in 2019, the deck extension, the professional landscaping, the—" "Mr. Mitchell," Morrison interrupted gently, "do you have receipts showing you personally paid for these improvements?" Marcus's confidence faltered, his momentum broken. "Well, they came out of our joint account, which both you and Mrs. Mitchell contribute to equally." "Yes, but—" "So Mrs. Mitchell funded half of every improvement you just mentioned?" Morrison's voice remained pleasant, but there was steel beneath the silk. Patterson jumped in quickly, clearly recognizing the trap his client had walked into. "The improvements increased the home's value significantly. My client's contributions to the household created substantial equity that were made as a husband living in the marital home," Morrison finished smoothly. "The same way Mrs. Mitchell's contributions were made as a wife living in her own home. Mr. Patterson, surely you're not suggesting that spouses should pay rent to live in their own homes?" Sarah watched the exchange with fascination. It was like watching a chess match where one player suddenly realized they'd been playing with half the pieces missing while their opponent had a full board. Patterson regrouped, pulling out another file. There's also the matter of mortgage payments. My client has been contributing to household expenses that included... Mr. Patterson, Morrison said, producing a folder from his own stack. I have here 8 years of bank statements showing Mrs. Mitchell's mortgage payments. Every single one came from her personal account, not the joint account. Mr. Mitchell never contributed a penny to the actual mortgage. The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus stared at the table, his face flushing, red with embarrassment and dawning comprehension. Sarah felt a pang of sympathy for him, but it was quickly overshadowed by anger at the sheer presumption that had brought them to this point. My client also requests his fair share of the home's equity, Patterson continued weakly, clearly grasping. At straws now. What equity? Morrison asked with genuine puzzlement. Mr. Mitchell has no ownership stake in the property. Mrs. Mitchell purchased it before marriage, holds the deed in her name alone, and has made all mortgage payments from her separate funds. In Colorado, this constitutes separate property that is not subject to division under any circumstances. Sarah finally spoke up, her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel that hadn't been there when Marcus filed for divorce. Marcus, did you ever actually think about how the mortgage was being paid? In 8 years, did you ever wonder why you never had to write a check to the bank? Why mortgage statements never came to your attention? Why you never had to deal with property taxes or homeowner's insurance? Marcus looked up at her with something like desperation in his eyes. I assumed the joint account covered everything. You assumed a lot of things, Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of 8 years of unspoken truths. You assumed you owned my house. You assumed you could sell it. You assumed I would just accept whatever division you and your expensive attorneys decided was fair. Patterson shuffled his papers again, clearly searching for any remaining angle of attack. There's still the matter of spousal support. My client has become accustomed to a certain standard of living during the marriage. Morrison actually laughed, a genuine sound of amusement that filled the conference room. Mr. Patterson, your client out-earns Mrs. Mitchell by nearly 3-to-1. He's a senior associate at a prestigious law firm making $180,000 annually. Mrs. Mitchell works for a nonprofit organization and makes $45,000. If anyone has a legitimate claim for spousal support in this marriage, it would be her, not him. The color drained from Patterson's face as the full scope of his client's deception, or self-deception, became clear. Clearly, Marcus hadn't mentioned the significant income disparity when he was busy painting himself as the financially disadvantaged party who deserved half of everything. Furthermore, Morrison continued with the patience of a professor explaining a basic concept to struggling students. Mrs. Mitchell has been subsidizing your client's lifestyle for 8 years by allowing him to live rent-free in her home. The fair market rental value of a 4-bedroom house in her neighborhood is approximately $3,200 per month. Over 8 years, that's over $300,000 in housing benefit he received at no cost. Marcus looked like he might actually be sick, his face taking on a greenish tinge. Sarah, you can't be serious. You're not going to ask me to pay you back rent, are you? Sarah studied her husband's face, the man she'd shared breakfast with for 8 years, who'd complained about their grocery bills while living for free in her house, who'd never once questioned why he never received mortgage statements or property tax bills. I'm not asking for back rent, Marcus, but I'm also not pretending that you somehow deserve half of something you never owned, never paid for, and never had any legal claim to. Patterson made one last desperate play, his voice taking on the tone of a man making a final argument before a hostile jury. The marriage itself created certain expectations of shared property. The marriage created expectations that spouses would treat each other with honesty and respect. Sarah interrupted, her voice sharper now than anyone in Sa'anina. The room had ever heard it. Not that one spouse could file for divorce and attempt to steal the other's property based on wild assumptions and male entitlement. Morrison leaned forward, his demeanor shifting from patient to predatory. Gentlemen, Let me be absolutely clear about Mrs. Mitchell's position. She will agree to an uncontested divorce with no claims on either side. Mr. Mitchell keeps his separate property, his car, his retirement accounts, his personal possessions. Mrs. Mitchell keeps hers. Her house, her car, her retirement accounts, her personal possessions. No spousal support claims from either party. No property division beyond personal belongings. Clean break. And if we don't agree to these terms? Patterson asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be pleasant. Then, we go to trial, where a judge will examine how Mr. Mitchell hired expensive attorneys to claim half of a house he never owned, while earning 3 times his wife's salary and living rent-free in her home for 8 years. We'll also explore how he filed for divorce without any meaningful discussion with his wife, hired aggressive counsel known for destroying women in court, and operated under assumptions so outrageous they border on delusional. How do you think that narrative will play in front of a Colorado family court judge, Mr. Patterson? The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had just been fired. Patterson whispered urgently with Marcus, whose face had gone from green to ashen as he finally grasped the full extent of his miscalculation and the legal quicksand he'd stepped into. After 10 minutes of hushed, increasingly frantic conversation, Patterson straightened his tie and tried to regain some semblance of professional dignity. My client needs time to consider his options. Of course, Morrison said pleasantly, his tone suggesting he was discussing dinner plans rather than the destruction of a man's financial expectations. But I should mention that Mrs. Mitchell has been very reasonable so far. That reasonableness has an expiration date. If this matter drags out, if we're forced to engage in protracted litigation, she may decide to pursue claims for the fair market value of housing she's provided, or spousal support based on the significant income disparity, or attorney's fees for having to defend against frivolous claims. Time is not your friend here, gentlemen. As they filed out of the conference room, Marcus caught Sarah's arm gently, his touch tentative and uncertain. Sarah, wait. Can we talk? Just for a minute? Please. She looked at his hand on her arm, then at his face. For a moment, she saw the man she'd fallen in love with 9 years ago. Vulnerable, uncertain, genuinely human. But she also saw the man who'd been so confident in his assumptions that he'd filed legal papers to steal her house, who'd hired aggressive attorneys to intimidate her, who'd spent 8 years taking her financial independence for granted. What do you want to say, Marcus? I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. But I'm truly sorry. I never meant for it to happen like this. His voice was small, defeated. Nothing like the confident man who'd strode into her kitchen 3 weeks ago. You filed for divorce and hired attorneys specifically, known for destroying wives in court. How exactly did you mean for it to happen? He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture she'd once found endearing, but now just looked desperate. I thought I was being practical. I thought I was protecting us both by having everything planned out legally. You thought you were protecting yourself by taking everything I owned. I didn't know it was yours. I swear, Sarah, I really thought we owned everything jointly. I thought that's how marriage worked. You thought wrong, she said firmly, pulling her arm away from his grasp. About a lot of things. About who owned what. About how marriage works. About who I am. Marcus's shoulders sagged like a man carrying an invisible weight. So this is it? 8 years? And it just ends like this? Sarah looked at her husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite forgiveness, but not quite hatred either. Just a profound sadness for what they'd both lost, and perhaps what they'd never really had. Marcus, you ended it when you filed those papers. You ended it when you assumed you could take my house. You ended it when you looked at me like I was an obstacle instead of a partner. She paused, studying his face one last time. This is just me refusing to be robbed in the process. She walked away, leaving Marcus standing in the hallway of the law firm, finally understanding that some assumptions come with a price too high to pay. 2 months later, Sarah stood in her kitchen on a bright Saturday morning in December, preparing coffee for one instead of two. The divorce had been finalized the week before, a quiet, uncontested proceeding that took less than 20 minutes in a Denver courtroom. Marcus had signed the papers without further protest, finally accepting that his 8-year miscalculation had cost him everything he'd thought he owned, but never actually possessed. The house felt different now. Not empty, as she'd feared it might, but genuinely peaceful for the first time in years. Sarah had spent the past few weeks methodically reclaiming spaces, rearranging furniture, and making small changes that reflected her authentic tastes rather than the compromises she'd made during marriage. The kitchen table now sat by the large window overlooking her winter garden, instead of in the center of the room, where Marcus had preferred it. The living room furniture faced the stone fireplace, instead of the large television that had dominated their evenings. Small changes, but they felt revolutionary, like reclaiming pieces of herself she'd forgotten she'd given away. The morning sunlight streamed through her windows, casting warm golden rectangles across the hardwood floors she'd chosen and paid for 9 years ago. Steam rose from her coffee mug, a handmade ceramic piece she'd bought at a local artist's studio, the kind of impractical but beautiful purchase Marcus had always questioned. Now she could fill her home with as many impractical, beautiful things as she wanted. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Coffee date this morning. I have news, and I'm practically vibrating with excitement." "Come over," Sarah typed back. "I have news too, and I want to hear yours first." Jessica arrived 30 minutes later, practically bouncing with excitement as she burst through the front door, carrying 2 large coffees from Mountain Roasters and a bag that smelled suspiciously like fresh pastries. "Okay, you first or me first? Actually, never mind. I can't wait. I have to tell you what I heard through the legal grapevine." "You're clearly about to explode, so go ahead," Sarah laughed, accepting one of the coffee cups and leading Jessica to the breakfast nook that now felt entirely her own. "I heard through very reliable sources that Robert Patterson is considering early retirement," Jessica said with undisguised glee, settling into the window seat with theatrical flair. Apparently, the senior partners weren't thrilled that he took on a major case without doing basic due diligence on the assets involved. Taking a man's word that he owned his wife's house without examining a single document? That's first-year law student-level incompetence. Sarah shook her head, feeling a complex mix of satisfaction and sympathy. "I almost feel bad for him. Almost." "Don't you dare feel bad for Robert Patterson," Jessica said firmly, pulling a chocolate croissant from the bag and breaking it in half. "That man has made a career out of intimidating women in divorce proceedings, using fear and legal complexity to bully them into unfair settlements. Having his reputation damaged by his own arrogance and laziness is nothing less than poetic justice." Jessica paused to sip her coffee, then leaned forward conspiratorially. "But wait, there's more. I also heard that Marcus has been struggling since the divorce was finalized." "Struggling how?" "Well, according to my source, who may or may not be a paralegal at his firm who owes me a favor, he's been making mistakes at work, missing deadlines, showing up looking like he slept in his car. His billable hours have dropped significantly, and there's talk that he might not make partner after all." Sarah felt a pang of something. Not quite sympathy, but not satisfaction either. "That's unfortunate." "Is it, though?" Jessica asked pointedly. "The man tried to steal your house, Sarah. He filed for divorce assuming he'd walk away with half of everything you owned while contributing nothing. He hired the most aggressive attorneys in Denver to intimidate you. I'd say a little professional. Consequence is the least he deserves." "You're probably right," Sarah admitted. I spent 8 years caring about his career, his success, his happiness. It's hard to turn that off completely." "That's what makes you a good person," Jessica said gently. "But Marcus made his choices. He's dealing with the consequences of his own actions, not anything you did to him." Sarah nodded, knowing her friend was right. She'd spent enough sleepless nights wrestling with guilt, and wondering if she could have handled things differently. But the truth was, she'd done nothing wrong. She'd simply refused to be robbed. "Now," Jessica continued, "what's your news? You sounded mysterious on the phone." Sarah's smile was genuinely excited for the first time in months. "I got a promotion at the nonprofit. They're making me director of community outreach, with a 35% salary increase and my own budget for program development." "Sarah, that's incredible!" Jessica reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "Tell me everything." "Well, the board was impressed with the financial literacy program I developed. You know, the one helping women understand their assets and rights before, during, and after major life changes. It's been so successful that we're expanding it statewide, and I'll be overseeing the rollout." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Sarah's experience with Marcus's financial assumptions had sparked an idea for a program that was now helping hundreds of other women avoid similar situations. "And," Sarah continued, unable to contain her excitement, "I've decided to use some of my new financial stability to make real improvements to the house. I'm adding a proper home office in the spare bedroom and converting the basement into a photography studio." Jessica raised her coffee mug in a toast. To Sarah Mitchell, homeowner, nonprofit director, and woman who refused to be underestimated or intimidated. They clinked mugs, and Sarah felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee and everything to do with finally truly being herself. That afternoon, Sarah was in her garden, cutting back the last of the season's roses in preparation for winter, when a familiar BMW pulled into her driveway. Marcus sat there for a long moment before emerging, looking uncertain and somehow smaller than she remembered. He'd lost more weight, she noticed, and his usually perfect appearance was slightly disheveled. He approached the garden gate cautiously, like someone approaching a wild animal that might bolt. "Hi, Sarah. Marcus." She didn't stop pruning, focusing on the task at hand. "What brings you by?" "I wanted to return your house key, and to apologize. Really apologize. Not the legal kind we do in conference rooms." Sarah accepted the key he held out, noting that his hands were shaking slightly. The key felt heavier than it should have, weighted with the symbolism of doors closing and new chapters beginning. "Okay, I'm listening." "I've been seeing a therapist," he began, shoving his hands into his coat pockets like a nervous teenager. "Dr. Rodriguez downtown. She specializes in helping people understand their unconscious biases and assumptions. She's helping me figure out how I got everything so catastrophically wrong." "And what have you learned?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious despite herself. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching her work among the rose bushes with steady, competent hands. "I learned that I was so focused on being the provider, the man in charge, the one with all the answers, that I never actually paid attention to our real life. I made assumptions based on what I thought a marriage should look like instead of seeing what ours actually was." Sarah paused in her pruning, considering his words. They sounded genuine, thoughtful. "Go on." "I learned that you never needed me to take care of you financially. You were taking care of yourself just fine before we met, and you kept taking care of yourself after. I was just there. Contributing, yes, but not essential. Not the foundation. I thought I was." The honesty in his voice surprised her. "And how does that make you feel?" "Stupid, embarrassed, angry at myself." He kicked at a small stone on the garden path. "Like I wasted 8 years of both our lives by never really seeing you for who you are. Dr. Rodriguez says I have deep-seated issues with control and assumptions based on gender roles I didn't even know I believed in." Sarah resumed her pruning, considering his words carefully. "Why are you telling me this, Marcus?" "Because you deserved better. Because I want you to know that I understand what I did wrong, even if it's too late to fix it. Because..." He trailed off, then started again with visible effort. "Because I loved you, Sarah. I really did. I just loved you wrong." The sadness in his voice was genuine, and Sarah felt her heart soften slightly, despite everything that had happened between them. I loved you too, Marcus. But love without respect isn't really love, is it? Love without seeing your partner as a complete, autonomous person isn't love, it's possession. No, he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the winter wind. It's not. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the December air crisp around them. Finally, Marcus spoke again. Are you happy? Now, I mean. Without me. Sarah looked. Around her garden. At her house visible through the bare tree branches. At the life she'd built and reclaimed, and was now expanding in directions she'd never imagined. I'm getting there. I feel like myself again, if that makes sense. Like I've stopped trying to be the person I thought you needed me to be. It makes perfect sense. He turned to go, then stopped and looked back at her one last time. Sarah, I know I don't have the right to ask this, but do you think you'll ever forgive me? Sarah set down her pruning shears and really looked at her ex-husband, the man who'd tried to steal her house out of sheer assumption and entitlement, the man who'd filed for divorce without warning and hired aggressive attorneys to intimidate her, but also the man she'd shared breakfast with for 8 years, who'd held her when her father died, who'd once known how to make her laugh. I think, she said carefully, choosing each word with precision, that forgiveness is something I'm working on. Not for you, but for me. Because carrying anger around is exhausting, and I have better things to do with my energy now. Marcus nodded, accepting the non-answer as more than he deserved. Take care of yourself, Sarah. You always were stronger than I gave you credit for. I always have taken care of myself, she replied, not unkindly but with finality. I just stopped, pretending I needed permission to do it. As his car disappeared down Maple Street, Sarah returned to her roses. The winter pruning was essential work, cutting away the dead and damaged growth so that new, stronger branches could emerge in spring. It was hard work, requiring sharp tools and decisive cuts, but it was necessary for healthy growth. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Hi Sarah, this is Tom Chen, Jessica's brother. She thought we might have a lot in common and suggested coffee sometime. If you're interested, I'd love to meet you. No pressure, though. Just thought I'd reach out. Hope you're having a good weekend. Sarah smiled, looking at the message. Tom, Chen. She vaguely remembered Jessica mentioning him over the years. A middle school teacher, recently divorced, loved hiking and cooking. Someone who, according to Jessica, actually pays attention to the world around him and treats people like complete human beings. She typed back, Hi Tom, I'd like that very much. How about next Saturday afternoon? I know a great coffee shop in Lodo. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with Colorado, Sarah Mitchell stood in her garden behind her house, planning improvements and new beginnings. She'd learned something valuable in the past few months. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is having someone try to take away what was never theirs to begin with. It reminds you exactly who you are and what you're worth. And Sarah Mitchell was worth far more than a man who'd spent 8 years assuming she was less than she was, who'd built his sense of security on foundations he'd never bothered to examine. She'd built a life before Marcus. She'd maintained her independence during their marriage without even realizing it. And she'd emerged from their divorce stronger, wiser, and more self-aware than ever. The house on Maple Street had weathered another storm, just as it had weathered many before. The foundation was solid, the structure sound, the future bright with possibility. And like its owner, it stood secure, valuable, and completely, utterly hers. Inside, Sarah made herself dinner for one, a simple pasta with herbs from her garden, poured a glass of the good wine she'd been saving, and settled into her newly arranged living room to plan her home office renovation. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new challenges, new growth. But tonight, Sarah Mitchell was exactly where she belonged, in her own home, making her own decisions, answering to no one but herself. And after 8 years of marriage to a man who'd never really seen her, that felt like the most luxurious thing in the world. The deed to her house sat safely in her filing cabinet, her name alone on every page, just as it always had been. Some things, Sarah had learned, are too important to assume, and some people are too valuable to underestimate. Marcus had learned that lesson the hard way, at considerable cost to his pride, his reputation, and his future. But Sarah had learned something even more valuable. She was stronger, smarter, and more independent than she'd ever given herself credit for. And that knowledge was worth more than any house, any marriage, any assumption about who she was supposed to be. She was exactly who she'd always been. Sarah Elizabeth Henderson Mitchell, homeowner, professional, survivor. And now, finally, she was free to be all of those things without apology, explanation, or compromise. The snow continued to fall outside her windows, covering the world in possibility. And Sarah Mitchell, secure in her own home and her own skin, planned for a future that belonged entirely to her. The sold sign went up on the house across the street on a sunny morning in June. Sarah watched from her kitchen window as the new neighbors moved in, a young couple with a toddler and a golden retriever that immediately began exploring the yard with the boundless enthusiasm that only dogs and small children possess. She'd spent the morning working in her new home office, reviewing grant applications for the nonprofit's expanded community programs. The promotion had opened doors she'd never expected, allowing her to implement ideas she'd been developing for years. Her salary increase had also allowed her to pay off her mortgage completely, a financial freedom that felt almost surreal. After years of careful budgeting and planning, the basement studio was nearly complete, transformed into a bright, airy space where she'd been rediscovering her love of photography, a hobby she'd abandoned somewhere in the middle of her marriage when Marcus had questioned the expense of equipment and the time it took away from more practical pursuits. The walls were lined with her recent work, candid shots of Denver's changing neighborhoods, portraits of nonprofit clients who'd become success stories, landscapes of the Colorado mountains that never failed to inspire her. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts about the afternoon's shoot. Sarah Mitchell speaking. Ms. Mitchell? This is Dr. Patricia Williams from Denver Community College. We spoke last month about our adult education program partnership. Of course, Dr. Williams. Have you made a decision about moving forward? We have, and we'd love to proceed with the full partnership. Your nonprofit's approach to financial literacy education for women in transition is exactly what our students need. When can we schedule a meeting to discuss implementation details and funding? After hanging up, Sarah smiled at the beautiful irony of it all. Her experience with Marcus's financial assumptions had sparked an idea for a program that was now helping thousands of other women understand their own financial situations before, during, and after major life changes. The program had been so successful that 5 other organizations across 3 states were interested in similar partnerships. A knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. Through the peephole, she saw Tom Chen holding a bouquet of sunflowers and wearing the slightly nervous smile she'd grown genuinely fond of over the past few months. "You're early," she said, opening the door with a grin that felt completely natural. "I finished grading papers faster than expected," Tom replied, offering the flowers with a small bow that made her laugh. "Plus, I was excited about our hiking plans. The weather's perfect for the trail you suggested." At 35, Tom was everything Marcus hadn't been. Attentive without being controlling, curious about her thoughts and opinions without trying to manage them, genuinely interested in her work without feeling threatened by her success. He was also refreshingly direct about practical matters, having learned his own hard lessons from a marriage that ended when his ex-wife decided she preferred his best friend and their shared bank account. "These are beautiful," Sarah said, accepting the sunflowers and breathing in their warm, summery scent. "Let me just grab my backpack and we can head out." As they drove toward the mountains in Tom's reliable Honda, a car he'd bought used and paid for himself, as he'd mentioned with the kind of practical pride Sarah found endlessly attractive. Tom glanced over at her. "You seem different today. Good different. Energized. I got some wonderful news about the adult education partnership this morning. And..." She paused, then smiled with genuine contentment. "I realized this morning that I haven't thought about Marcus in over 2 weeks. That used to happen maybe once a month if I was lucky. How does that feel?" Sarah considered the question as they climbed into the foothills, Denver shrinking behind them in the rearview mirror. Free. Like I've finally stopped carrying around someone else's version of who I was supposed to be. Like I can just be myself without constantly measuring that self against someone else's expectations. They hiked for 4 hours through Aspen, groves and pine forests, talking about everything and nothing. Tom was easy to be with. No hidden agendas, no assumptions about what she needed or wanted, no attempts to manage or improve her. When she mentioned being tired, he asked if she wanted to rest, not if she needed him to carry her pack. When she pointed out a beautiful view or an interesting bird, he actually looked and engaged instead of dismissing her observations as unimportant. On the drive back to Denver, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Steve Chen called me again. Apparently Marcus has been asking mutual friends about you. Wants to know if you're seeing anyone, how you're doing, whether you ever ask about him. Thought you should know." Sarah showed Tom the message without hesitation. "Your cousin is apparently still curious about my life." Tom snorted with amusement. "Marcus is your ex, right? The one who tried to steal your house?" "That's the one. And now he's checking up on your love life through intermediaries?" "Apparently so." Tom was quiet for a moment, navigating the winding mountain road with the careful attention of someone who respected both his passengers and other drivers. "Do you want me to tell Steve to tell Marcus to back off? I mean, it's absolutely none of his business. But if it bothers you or makes you uncomfortable..." Sarah felt a rush of genuine affection for this man who offered to handle the situation without assuming she couldn't handle it herself, who asked what she wanted instead of deciding what she needed. "No, but thank you for offering." "Marcus lost the right to information about my life when he filed for divorce and tried to steal my property. If he's curious, he can stay curious." That evening they grilled salmon on Sarah's back deck, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Tom was telling an animated story about one of his middle school students, a kid who'd been struggling with math until Tom found out he was passionate about baseball and started teaching fractions through batting averages, when Sarah's doorbell rang. "Expecting someone?" Tom asked, noting the surprise on her face. "No." Sarah frowned, checking her phone for missed calls or messages. Nothing. Through the front door's glass panels, she could see Marcus standing on her porch, holding what looked like a bottle of wine and wearing his most charming smile. The one that had once melted her heart, but now just made her tired and slightly irritated. "Stay here and enjoy your dinner," she told Tom firmly. "I'll handle this." She opened the door, but didn't step aside or invite Marcus in. "What do you want, Marcus?" His confidence faltered visibly when he realized she wasn't alone, that there was clearly another man in her house, in her life. "I heard you might be seeing someone. I brought wine, that Chianti you used to like. I thought maybe we could talk." "About what?" "About us. About maybe trying again. I've been in therapy for months, Sarah. I've changed. I understand what I did wrong, and I want to make it right. I want to earn back your trust." Sarah looked at her ex-husband, noting how he'd dressed carefully for this visit, his best casual shirt, expensive cologne, the wine he'd chosen because he remembered it was her favorite brand. The effort he'd put into trying to win her back was almost touching. Almost. "Marcus, we're divorced. You made sure of that when you filed papers and tried to steal my house. You made that choice without consulting me, and now I've moved on. And I've moved on too. I'm happy. I'm dating someone who actually sees me as an equal partner, instead of property to be managed or an accessory to someone else's life. Marcus's face crumpled slightly, the careful composure he'd built for this visit beginning to crack. Please, Sarah, just give me a chance to show you how much I've changed, how much I've learned. You want to show me you've changed? Sarah's voice was calm, but absolutely firm. Then respect my decision. Respect my boundaries. Respect that I don't owe you a second chance just because you finally figured out what you did wrong. She could see Tom through the kitchen window, giving her space to handle her own situation, but clearly ready to intervene if needed. The difference between the two men was stark and telling. Tom trusted her to manage her own life, while Marcus had shown up assuming he could charm his way back into it. I love you, Marcus said desperately, playing what he clearly thought was his strongest card. No, Sarah replied gently, but without hesitation. You love the idea of me. You love having someone to come home to, someone to make your life comfortable and manageable. But you never loved me enough to actually see me, to know me, to treat me as a complete person with my own thoughts and agency. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to deflate like a punctured balloon. So that's it? 8 years? And it's just over? It was over the moment you assumed you could take my house, Marcus. Everything since then has just been paperwork and legal formalities. After he left, driving away with slumped shoulders and the unopened bottle of wine, Sarah returned to the back deck where Tom was quietly cleaning up their dinner dishes without being asked. You okay? He asked, his concern genuine but not overwhelming. Yeah. She settled back into her chair, watching the last light fade from the sky and feeling completely at peace. It's strange, you know. For months after he left, I wondered if I'd made the right choice. If maybe I should have tried harder to save the marriage, been more forgiving, more understanding. And now? Now I realize there was nothing to save. You can't build a real partnership with someone who sees you as a supporting character in their own story. You can't love someone you don't actually see. Tom nodded thoughtfully, his quiet wisdom one of the things she'd come to cherish about him. My ex-wife used to say I was too boring, too predictable. She wanted more excitement, more passion, more drama. It took me a while to understand that what she really wanted wasn't intimacy. It was intensity. She confused chaos with connection. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged overhead, the lights of Denver twinkling in the distance. Finally, Tom spoke again. Can I ask you something? Of course. What are you looking for now? In a relationship, I mean. Because I really like you, Sarah, and I think we could have something special. But I want to make sure we're looking for the same things. The question was so refreshingly direct, so different from Marcus's assumptions and manipulations, that Sarah almost laughed with relief. Honesty. Partnership. Someone who sees me as I am instead of who they think I should be. Someone who wants to build something together instead of trying to manage or fix me. I can do that, Tom said simply. More than that, I want that. Good, Sarah replied, reaching across the small space between their chairs to take his hand, because I'm done being anyone other than exactly who I am. 6 months ago, Sarah Mitchell had been blindsided by divorce papers and the shocking revelation that her husband thought he owned her house. Tonight, she sat on her deck with a man who asked what she wanted instead of assuming he knew, planning a future that belonged entirely to her, but might, someday, be shared with someone who truly saw and valued her. The house on Maple Street had seen many changes over the years, seasons turning, families growing, lives beginning and ending and beginning again, but it had never sheltered anyone, quite like Sarah Elizabeth Henderson Mitchell, a woman who'd learned that the most valuable thing she owned wasn't her house at all. It was her sense of self, her independence, her refusal to be anything less than a complete person. And that, no one could ever take away, assume ownership of, or fail to recognize again.